This week on the Wheelhouse, reproductive rights, what it was like before Roe versus Wade, and what it's like after the reversal. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Most of us think of Connecticut as a progressive state when it comes to reproductive rights and health care, but guess what? It wasn't always that way. In the 1970s, Connecticut was the site of a huge battle for reproductive freedoms, a battle so huge that it paved the way for the 1973 passage of Roe versus Wade. Today on the Wheelhouse, we're looking back at the history of abortion in Connecticut. Then we'll dive back into what's happening now. Now, to help me travel back in Connecticut's history, Sonali Chakravarti, professor of government at Wesleyan University. Professor Chakravarti, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to dive into a major ruling in our state's history. First, I want to invite folks to please give us a call if you have a question on this issue or if you'd like to make a comment about the general landscape of reproductive rights in America. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Women v. Connecticut is the ruling we want to talk about. But first, can you just paint a picture for us? What did 1971 look like in the state for reproductive rights? Abortion not legal, right? Under any circumstances?
Right. At that time, Connecticut had one of the most restrictive abortion bans in the country, and many of the statutes had been on the books since 1860. For example, in Connecticut, the person who performed an abortion could be fined up to $1,000 or imprisoned for 5 years. The woman who tried to get an abortion herself was guilty of a felony and could be jailed. Even encouraging the commission of an abortion was a crime punishable by a fine of $500 or up to 1 year in prison. So there really was this very strict code in place at that time.
Slow Burn, a podcast from Slate, covered Women versus Connecticut in its season that focused on Roe v. Wade. Here's a clip from that episode featuring Rhea Hirschman, one of the women recruited to join the lawsuit in the 1970s. At the time, she was a grad student at Wesleyan University.
They played this tape of women talking about their illegal abortion experiences. And up until that point, this wasn't a topic that I'd really thought very much about. And I remember listening to that tape and thinking, I want to do something to make sure that no woman ever has to tell a story like this again.
Professor Chakravarti, who were the major players who decided to fight against these restrictions?
So the major players were a group of female attorneys connected with the feminist group New Haven Women's Liberation. And so it was a group of about 6 attorneys, including Nancy Stearns, who was involved in similar legislation in New York, also Katie Rohraback, a prominent New Haven lawyer. And they, along with this feminist group, spearheaded Women v. Connecticut. But what was really important to them was that many women get involved in this case, that they wanted to challenge the abortion laws in the state, not just from people who are currently pregnant, but they actually wanted to make all women of childbearing age as potential plaintiffs in this case. And the way they did that was to record testimonies of women who had to go out of state for abortions, who had to have abortions that led to dangerous complications, talk about their experiences, and then they would play these tapes in different community groups at different universities, such as what happened with Wesleyan, with Rhea Hirschman. And what they were doing were they were really, spreading this idea that the restrictive laws in Connecticut were really impacting women's liberty and equality, their ability to be fully functioning citizens in the world.
Ann Hill, who was a student at Yale, didn't necessarily sit at the council table there, but had a big role in that New Haven women's liberation movement. Hey, and she was a big focus on that Slate Slow Burn podcast. Professor Chakravarti, what states were those women going to for abortions? Where would you have to go? I would imagine you're going over the Connecticut border.
Right, and we know that New Haven Women's Liberation helped a lot of women and escorted them to Montreal for abortions. Once New York legalized it, it was possible to go to New York, but it seemed like one of the more common places was to go to Montreal. And the way women would hear about this is that they would talk to their friends, to their mom's friends about, do you know anybody who's had an abortion? Where can I go for this? And there was even a network of clergy and counselors who would tell women about this, and the fact that these psychologists and counselors and clergy members were all involved in this also led to them being included as plaintiffs in this case, Women v. Connecticut, because they were saying that the way the laws are written, that they couldn't actually give good advice to women thinking about their options afterward. And so they were silenced in that way. And so they were one of the three groups that were plaintiffs in the case. For Women v. Connecticut, the first group was childbearing women, the second group was medical personnel, and the third group were clergy and counselors. And for the lawsuit, there were 800 plaintiffs, combining all of these three groups.
In Slow Burn season on Roe versus Wade, they featured this clip from 1972 of a shout out to the Women versus Connecticut lawsuit from Roe versus Wade attorney Sarah Weddington.
One of the cases decided since our last argument, December 13th, was the second Connecticut case, Abel versus Markle.
Abilene versus Markle, that case commonly referred to as Women versus Connecticut. Weddington citing an opinion from a judge in the Connecticut case, John Newman. How did Women versus Connecticut influence Roe versus Wade, Professor Chakravarty?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And that the name of that case, Abilene versus Markle, which we know is Women in Connecticut, is named for Janice Abilene, just the first name alphabetically in this list of 100 who were plaintiffs in that case. As Sarah Waddington said there, Women v. Connecticut too influences Roe v. Wade, and so I just wanted to address that issue. So the case Women v. Connecticut was decided by a panel of three judges in Connecticut who found that there was an overreach of police power by trying to enforce abortion laws in this way. The judges in Connecticut also found that for due process to be in place, women needed to have some time after conception to be able to decide whether they wanted to have the child or not. And so they ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in Women v. Connecticut, and that ended the restriction on abortion in Connecticut at that time. But as soon as that decision came down, the governor of Connecticut at that time, Thomas Meskel, who was Catholic, really felt that it went against what he believed and many other Catholic leaders in the state. And he rallied to have an even more restrictive a bill passed in the Connecticut legislature that reinstated the restrictions on abortion and went even further. After Women v. Connecticut, after that ruling, there was a bill passed in Connecticut saying that, essentially saying that we should understand life to begin at conception, and therefore abortion should be banned completely in the state. And the fact that passed, shows what kind of what a polarized moment this was in the history of Connecticut, and also the tension between the governor and the courts at that time. So after Women v. Connecticut, we have a new law that's restrictive, and then Women v. Connecticut has to organize again, and so Women v. Connecticut 2 goes forward with 2,000 plaintiffs. And then that case is taken up, and three judges in that case rule again in favor of the plaintiffs, of the women in that case. Judge Newman, who you mentioned, wrote in his opinion for that case that we need some way to think about rights of the mother and rights of the fetus, that the state has an interest in protecting both these groups. It doesn't make sense to only focus on one. And he said that one way to do this is to think about the moment of viability. That is, when can the fetus live outside of the mother, as the moment when the state has increased interest in allowing that life to go forward.
And they determined that was at about 28 weeks at that point?
At that point, right. And so he introduced that, and it was really his compromise position, his way of saying, like, I get that some people, you might be, bothered, morally troubled by the idea of abortion, and I get that women need to be able to make these decisions to have control over their bodies and their lives. What is this compromise position? And for him, it was viability, and that ended up being very influential for the Supreme Court and Justice Blackmun when he is, when he's thinking about the ruling in Roe v. Wade.
888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. If you have a question or comment regarding reproductive rights in Connecticut and beyond. What a fascinating time in America. This is some 52, 53 years ago, and you talked about Judge Newman's decision. This is at a time when the Nixon campaign, they're running for president in 1972, and they're very much focusing on abortion and how it should be illegal in the country. And this is a Nixon appointee in John Newman, who is on the bench in Connecticut and making a decision that obviously not something that the Nixon campaign would necessarily agree with. That's very much a juxtaposition from what we might see with judges nowadays when we're so concerned about whether or not they are tied to politics. There's that angle and how interesting that is, but also the clergy members who are advocating for access to abortions. Seems to kind of contradict how we usually think about religious institutions when it comes to reproductive rights. Did that surprise folks back then?
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think it just showed, how many different, positions are involved in this debate, how many different people are involved. I mean, I think what it can be troubling for some today in the discussions of abortion, especially when it feels like the Supreme Court, this majority male institution, making decisions about it, is that it's missing like all of the people who are affected by abortions, who are talking to people about how to plan their lives, how to plan childbearing. And so the fact that clergy actually want to give people good guidance about their lives. I think that was surprising then and could be surprising now that they are also very, very involved in reproductive rights in many different states.
Are there battles for reproductive rights playing out today that you would say mirror the fight that took place in Connecticut in the 1970s and this multiple-tiered fight?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the what's happening now, that there are states that have the laws that Connecticut had in 1970 and that have come into existence since the Dobbs decision. Laws banning abortion outright, states that don't make an exception for rape or incest in the case of the mother. We saw the case in Arizona, which was allowing a statute from the 1860s to be valid in that state before it was repealed. So we really, in a way, it is this almost deja vu of states being where Connecticut was in 1970. But one thing that I think is really interesting is that currently Connecticut is in a very different position. Governor Ned Lamont really wants people to see Connecticut as a state that wants people to have access to safe abortions, even people coming from other states. One thing that Connecticut did in 1990 was that it codified the protection of access to abortion in state law. So it's not entirely dependent on the Supreme Court for ensuring that. But also Lamont has signed into laws protection for medical personnel who perform abortions, who might be sued by other states. We also allow in Connecticut nurse practitioners and nurse midwives to perform some abortion procedures in addition to prescribing medication abortion. And so right now, Connecticut is considered to be a safe haven for people seeking abortions, and we have laws that protect that.
And we're going to try to get into in the next segment about what happens in case there is any kind of Supreme Court decision coming up. And I think that's important to talk about. But 888-720-9677, the number to call, 888-720-9677. We're taking this hour your questions and comments on reproductive rights in Connecticut and beyond. Are there any strategies the plaintiffs used that were especially effective in Women v. Connecticut, a.k.a. Abele versus Markle, that have had a lasting impact in the social movement for reproductive rights?
I think one strategy that we saw in Women v. Connecticut is the importance of testimony of actual experiences, right? The details of what happened. There's a case even of a mother in Meriden who in 1970 was prosecuted for helping her teenage daughter get an abortion, right? Like learning these details of what they did, what happened, how the mother felt, how the daughter felt, right? These are the testimonies that really stay with people, and I think we're seeing this now in hearing oftentimes in the case of a court case about what's happening to women who don't have access to abortion, or in a state where the life of the mother has to be at stake for a doctor to perform an abortion, what that feels like, what those discussions are in hospitals and doctors' offices. So I think the central role of testimony as it reveals how people's lives intersect with the law is something that we can take from Women v. Connecticut.
And then a lot of the work that you've done are on juries and the major role that they play in landmark rulings. Are we seeing jury trials in abortion cases anywhere? And how are they playing out if we are?
No, I haven't seen that, and I've written kind of opinion pieces about why that might be useful. In my own work, I see jury trials as the place where we navigate difficult social and political questions, and it's okay for different juries to have different outcomes like that reasonable people disagree on what to do in complex cases. But I think juries are one place that we should see how juries respond to some really restrictive abortion legislation. Like, would a group of 12 people really want to punish a woman for seeking an abortion? Want to have a mother who has helped her daughter secure an abortion, be fined or imprisoned for that? Because I think juries are also a place where we see, do the laws on the books correspond with how people actually want to live, and like what kind of democracy we want to live in? And if there's a space between those two things, juries are a place where we see that, where we see the lack of synchronicity in those things.
Let's wrap up this conversation by getting your final thoughts on what we should be able to learn from Women v. Connecticut and the lasting impact it's had on reproductive rights in America.
I think the main thing to learn is the long game of social justice that the women in New Haven's Women Liberation in 1971 that came up with this could never have thought that Connecticut in 50 years down the road would be an example for other states that were trying to change access to reproductive rights. So I think not getting discouraged with short-term losses because of the really huge strides that were made in Connecticut, starting with Women v. Connecticut.
And recruiting hundreds of women and also getting all that testimony as well.
Right.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You just heard Sonali Chakravarti, professor of government at Wesleyan, break down Connecticut's role in the fight for access to reproductive health care. Professor Chakravarti, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thanks very much for having me.
Great time having you on the show this morning. Coming up, we're entering the present day, except much of what's happening today kind of mirrors the events of the 1970s. What are your thoughts on the attacks against reproductive rights? Want to hear from you? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're talking about reproductive health care in Connecticut and beyond. Wesleyan professor Sonali Chakravarti just gave us a little window into Connecticut's past. The state's played an integral role in the passage of Roe versus Wade back in the 1970s with Women v. Connecticut, I believe, versus Markle. But now we're getting to today, where the Supreme Court is ruling on some major legislation that could impact access to reproductive rights across the country. To help me break this down, Amanda Becker, Washington correspondent for the 19th, is here with me. Hallelujah. Amanda, welcome to the Wheelhouse.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you on the show, folks. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. We could talk about Connecticut. We could talk about beyond. Do give us a call. Amanda's done such a great job covering these issues and other important issues in an interesting time in America in 2024 for the 19th. In the last segment, we heard about how people from Connecticut played a role in the 1973 passage of Roe versus Wade. But today, with the ruling against Roe versus Wade, we're seeing new fights play out across the U.S. Are the battles for reproductive health care mirroring those that played out in the 1970s? And if not, how do they differ?
To some extent, yes, except I would say now the abortion rights movement is on defense, whereas in the 70s it was on offense coming out of the 60s. So that was a time back then where many states ahead of the Roe v. Wade decision were already legalizing abortion. And it's the states you might expect, like New York was one of the earliest, as you've already discussed today. So now we're kind of, it's like the people are still there, the populace, the electorate still very much supports legal access to abortion, but you see more states moving to ban it in some capacity or altogether than to protect it so far. And a lot of that is just due to, how our democracy is set up. Things like gerrymandering affect this in terms of state houses, because a lot of the activity is at the state level right now, both for the abortion rights movement and for the anti-abortion movement.
SCOTUS has just less than a month to go to make a ruling here, the Supreme Court of the United States, on a really major issue, a case that will have nationwide implications. They'll be weighing in on whether to impose restrictions to a commonly used abortion pill called mifepristone, part of the two-drug regimen there. Amanda, where is that case right now, and who are some of the major players?
That case is before the court, and we could literally get it as soon as tomorrow, the decision in that case.
Wow.
So this case was brought by an alliance of anti-abortion doctors and healthcare providers in Texas. This alliance formed after the Dobbs ruling because, curtailing access to medication abortion is a top priority of the anti-abortion movement. More than half of abortions in this country are now done with medication. They know that to stop abortion, they need to stop medication abortion specifically. It's also, easy. You can send it across state lines. Someone in a state with an abortion ban can order it off the internet. They can self-manage their abortion. And so this is why this is a top priority. This alliance formed to bring the case. They are represented by attorneys from the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is, when you start looking into these cases, they're involved in almost all of them. That's a group that started in Arizona, but has become very powerful in Washington, D.C. It's kind of like a far-right Christian law firm, is how you could probably best describe it. So we could get that decision as early as tomorrow. Friday is also a decision day this week for the Supreme Court. June is a really busy month. That's when we got Dobbs. They're trying to get all of their decisions out from this term so they can recess for the summer. Now, we do think that there's a potential these decisions could continue into July this year because there are still so many outstanding. But tomorrow and Friday are both decision days. Now, this case has been narrowed in scope a little bit, the mifepristone case. And as you said, it's one of a two-drug combo that you take for most medication abortions. This is the most common way to do it. The original case filed by this alliance of anti-abortion doctors, they were challenging just the FDA approval overall. So the FDA approved mifepristone back in 2000. As this case has come up to the Supreme Court, lower courts have kind of narrowed the scope. And, so the Supreme Court can do whatever it wants. It's the Supreme Court after all. They can answer questions in cases that weren't asked. They can change the scope of a case. But right now, they're believed to be weighing in on kind of subsequent changes to how you can access the drug that they may roll back.
Amanda,
so it could be like telemedicine or something like that.
Two follow-ups there. Okay, we can get into let's keep that in our back pocket. Two follow-ups really quickly. You'd still be able to take misoprostol. Is there a but there?
That's a much less pleasant experience for the patient. It's more, it's just not the standard of care that doctors prefer to provide. Again, though, you can order these, and you can order this drug from organizations that are not in the U.S. So if for some reason there was a nationwide ban on mifepristone, there are other ways to do medication abortion. There are also other countries from which you can get this medication.
Telemedicine being one, maybe?
Yeah, and like there's a group called Aid Access actually that is very active in this space. I believe they're based in the Netherlands. I know it's not anywhere near here. People would have to turn to something like that in order to access that medication here.
And then, so Connecticut obviously has protections in place for mifepristone contraception as a whole. But does that matter if there's a federal ruling here? Does that all kind of go away?
It would matter because the Supreme Court applies to the law of the land. And I would say, just real quickly, mifepristone is not contraception. And we can talk about that in a minute. Because right now we're also seeing an effort to kind of redefine what contraception is, because the anti-abortion movement believes that a lot of forms of contraception are abortifacients, and they're not. That is not what they are medically. That is not the process that it causes. They are not used for abortions, but there is an effort to kind of redefine some of these things in that abortion category.
Connecticut's Attorney General William Tong said during a press conference back in March that he was optimistic that the Supreme Court would ultimately side with the FDA, but he also underscored the potential for this lawsuit and other similar cases to upend abortion access nationally. He said Connecticut would fight tooth and nail to maintain these rights in the state, but is there the potential that fighting tooth and nail wouldn't be enough?
I mean, as I said, the case right now seems like it's been narrowed. So I would be surprised if the Supreme Court tries to, completely undo the 2000 approval by the FDA.
Okay.
But in Connecticut, you are a safe harbor state. You have what is called a shield law. You were one of the first states to pass an abortion shield law. And what those are intended to do is to protect the healthcare providers in a state that supports abortion access who might be treating patients from other states. So another state that I'm really familiar with their shield law, because I actually wrote a book about abortion that will be out in September, but it's Massachusetts. And they were very careful when they were writing their law to kind of cover telemedicine, to cover gender affirming care. So actually the patients don't even need to come to the doctors. It protects those doctors if they're, getting on a Zoom and doing telemedicine.
Amanda,
and then
we have to take a quick break here because we have some pledge happening in the studio, but we will pick this up in a moment. It's a very important place to stop. You're listening to the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano, and I'm joined by Amanda Becker, a journalist from the 19th. Hey, we got cut off a little bit as we were going to a break here in Connecticut as we are doing the Wheelhouse live on Connecticut Public. Just wanted to clear up, if mifepristone and that FDA ruling is overturned and that approval is overturned, which it sounds like it won't be, based on some of the reporting that you've done. But if it is, folks in Connecticut and elsewhere would have to access mifepristone maybe overseas?
Yes, or they would have to go to a physician or a healthcare provider who knows other ways to do medication abortion without that specific drug. And there are ways. Like I track kind of a doctor in Arizona. She was one of the characters in my book and one of the main people in it. And for example, she walked me through, there are other medication combinations that can do this. They might just be not quite as good. They're safe, just not quite as pleasant of an experience for the patient. Or it could be more expensive. But yes, that the mifepristone, if for some reason they undid the 2000 approval of that, that would affect everyone in the entire country. You're
just trying to make it clear that folks will still have access to reproductive care and abortions at this point, if this ruling is somehow, this approval is somehow reversed.
If they have the means and a healthcare provider who knows what to do, yes.
And that's always the question that we have, unfortunately, on this topic is means. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But Connecticut, a safe harbor state, what other states are people traveling to in order to get certain reproductive care and to perform reproductive care in the wake of some of these states really trying to restrict access?
Yeah, so on the East Coast, it's, Massachusetts is a big one. They have a really strong shield law. New York is another. They have a strong shield law. Pretty much the Northeast, abortion is legal, and these are kind of safe harbor states, safe havens. Now, the problem is they're geographically distant for a lot of the people trying to get abortions. So Maryland is one of the states that is the farthest south that protects abortion. There are clinics opening there, including clinics that specialize in kind of later points of pregnancy. And, out west, California, is a safe state, as is Washington State, Oregon, New Mexico. It's kind of it's the US South and the Midwest that are really kind of turning into abortion deserts. And, even a place like Ohio, I grew up in Ohio, they just added abortion protections to their constitution last year. And that, protects it on paper, but that was after a 20-year effort by the anti-abortion movement to kind of pass a bunch of laws that made it harder to get an abortion and made it harder for clinics to stay open. So even though it's legal there's only a few clinics. So just because, it's legal on paper doesn't mean it's easy to access abortion in a given state.
Very important clarification there. I want to remind folks that there's just about 10 minutes left to call on the show, so give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. I reached out to get some statistics from local providers and supporters of the type of reproductive care we're talking about today, maybe add some context to that situation of trying to clear up these reproductive care deserts. And Jessica Puck, co-founder of the Reach Fund, says 20% of abortion, her nonprofit funds, have been for people out of state. Planned Parenthood of Southern New England says they've seen a 59% increase in patients who have traveled from the 18 states that have banned abortion since the 2022 Dobbs decision. Planned Parenthood saying it's responding by working to decrease appointment wait times and to expand patient access to abortion care. I want to button up Connecticut here in this conversation and say that there have been a wave of laws to protect access to abortion and other reproductive rights in Connecticut. Less so in 2024. Legislative session couldn't protect caregivers in Catholic hospitals if they had to render certain reproductive care services. At least they wanted to extend these protection, wanted to expand fertility care and Medicaid coverage in support of reproductive care as well. That both those proposals didn't pass this year. Legislature did find $3 million in ARPA funds to support those efforts we talk about with Planned Parenthood of Southern New England. The Guttmacher Institute has Connecticut as a protective state. Guttmacher Institute, one of these institutions focusing on policy, and they're saying that Connecticut has protective policy, but it's not most protective, Amanda. What can a state like Connecticut do to, I guess, better expand access to reproductive care?
I mean, the number one thing would be getting it into a state constitution as opposed to statute, right?
Okay.
Because constitutions are a lot more difficult to amend than a state house passing a law and a governor signing it. Right now, you have Democrats in charge. That may not always be the case. You might, see kind of a political shift like some other states have seen. And, that really makes it just adds a layer because it's much harder it's actually much harder to take something out of the Constitution than it is to add it. So that's why you see states that already protect abortion by statute also voting to add it to their constitution in a form of a ballot measure. So that would be one thing. Another thing would be just really trying to improve access. And we just saw yesterday, I think it was, Massachusetts had a law that went into effect, or funding rather, that kicked in for a public awareness campaign about what's called crisis pregnancy centers. These are centers run by the anti-abortion movement. They are not healthcare clinics. I believe some municipalities in Connecticut actually were the first to pass this kind of law. And so really this is a public awareness campaign that if you go to one of these centers, they're going to counsel you to not get an abortion because you're not actually going to an abortion clinic. And the issue is sometimes, in fact, quite often, if you Google abortion clinic near me, it will actually give you a crisis pregnancy center as one of the first results. And so there, stuff like that are things that states that want to further protect abortion, that's something they can do, is really kind of work on the kind of public awareness and access side.
And advocates for reproductive rights and access say that the state could provide funding too, while Planned Parenthood of Southern New England was able to get about $3 million. The Reach Fund has not gotten any state funds. So that's one thing to point out. When it comes to reproductive rights and how the issue is being discussed on the campaign trail, we got a clip for you now featuring Vice President Kamala Harris. We're talking about America now. We're widening our scope here. In this Instagram post from last week, Harris points the finger at Republican senators, referring to them as Donald Trump's friends of the former president, for voting against a bill protecting access to contraception. She's worried about the ability to access birth control pills, particularly if the former president were to defeat Biden and Harris in November.
If given an opportunity, Donald Trump would sign a national abortion ban. A second Trump term would really mean more harm, more pain, and less freedoms. But we're not going to let that happen.
Can you unpack that statement? Is a second Donald Trump presidential term a devastating blow to reproductive rights?
I think it probably would be, although I disagree that it would come in the form of a national abortion ban. That's what we talk about. I think it's the easiest to understand. The reality is, unless something very unexpected happens in November, there aren't going to be 60 votes in the U.S. Senate to either protect abortion or to ban it. And so I think the conversation that is actually more interesting is what other ways, right? There are many levers in our government and ways to get things done. Roe was a court case. Dobbs was a court case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I think it is far more likely to either see court decisions that farther curtail abortion, to see, state level efforts. And on a national level, in addition to a Supreme Court case, it could come in the form of the Department of Justice and what they choose to prosecute or not prosecute and how they interpret laws. It could come in the form of appointees at the FDA. You don't need to bring a case about a drug and its approval if you can just undo it within your agency. And so while I do think that a Donald Trump second presidency would be hostile to reproductive rights, I don't know that it would come in the form of a quote unquote national ban passed by Congress.
And just to loop back and kind of close the loop on what we were talking about in the first segment, it was really fascinating that in Women v. Connecticut, you had the decision from a Nixon appointee and John Newman, where nowadays we're talking about all these judges that Donald Trump was able to appoint in his last term. And there's just a juxtaposition there on a Nixon appointee, a Republican appointee, making that decision back in 1971. Hey, can you help me understand? I know you've been following this. Where else we're going to see reproductive rights sort of on the ballot in November? Maybe important state races. How would any change to the so-called balance of power in Congress maybe impact access to abortion, contraception, and other forms of reproductive care?
Yeah, I pulled this right before we talked because it changes every day. So right now, there are confirmed measures that will be on the ballot in Colorado. There's actually 2 competing amendments in Colorado, in South Dakota, in Florida, and in Maryland. Now, like I was saying, Maryland already protects abortion by statute. But what they're trying to do is get it into their state constitution. There are also potential ballot measures in Nevada, Arizona, Montana, Nebraska, Missouri, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, New York. And they're just still in the signature gathering phase and haven't officially got onto the ballot yet. Now, so far in every state that has had an amendment directly on the ballot for voters have every time sided with abortion rights. And so these ballot measures are seen as a major threat by the anti-abortion movement, because what's happening is the states one by one, the people are speaking. And it's in states where sometimes their laws are very out of step with what the voters want for various reasons. And so this is, the electorate's way of saying, no, this is what we want, and we're going to do it directly. But not every state has a ballot measure process that allows citizens to get measures onto the ballot.
I have to have you do this in 30 seconds or less. But the reason why we have this conversation, the reason why you do this all at the amendment, I would imagine, is because reproductive rights issues are most importantly impacting, or most disproportionately impacting, people of color and people that don't have any money.
Correct. I mean, we're seeing the abortion rates are up. We're seeing the states that people are coming to What is much harder to track, though, is what are people having to do? What are the hurdles they're having to overcome to get that care? How are they raising the money? Are they, putting it all on their credit cards? How are they paying for childcare? These are all things that are going to disproportionately impact people who are less resourced.
About, in Connecticut, 40% of households earn around or even below the federal poverty level. Reproductive advocates here worry about abortion care in particular. Should a person from one of those local households suddenly face that cost, maybe have to put it on the credit card, as you mentioned. Just incredible work that you all do at the 19th. Follow Amanda's work on West Virginia politics, which are getting very interesting right now. So go to the the 19th website to find that. And thank you for coming on the show this week, Amanda.
Thank you so much.
So great to talk to you. So great to finally talk to you. So great for the 19th to be back online here after a retreat. I hope everybody is doing well at the 19th. A great program, and the amendment as well that you can listen to. Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn. The next time we have a live program, Chloe Wynn is going to be married. So I want to make sure that we all give a shout out to Chloe and Trey, and that we wish you all an eternity of love. So much excitement happening around the Wheelhouse, which is edited by executive producer Katie Tolarski. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Thanks to Tess Terrible for helping us in studio. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. You've been listening to the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Thanks for listening.